To transition to the next segment of the conference, I'd like to welcome all of you to this panel entitled Human Rights and the United Nations Paradox and Promise. One thing I think we all learned from the pandemic is that in an online panel and in cyberspace with people from different parts of the country and even from the world, it's very challenging to do land acknowledgements because we're not all in the same place or space. But the University of Alberta, where I work, respectfully acknowledges that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. And I invite all of you as audience members and panelists to also consider the land that you are located on now. And in the spirit of this conference on igniting change, what that means in terms of responsibilities as well as actions. Well, action is also relevant when we turn to consider the United Nations. I mean, it's very interesting that Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, argued in 2022 that, and I'm quoting here, global decision-making is plagued by gridlock and a fundamental paradox lies at the heart of it. So for Guterres, the paradox is that there is typically agreement about common threats like the climate crisis or having unregulated progress of advanced digital technologies. But this recognition does not necessarily lead to common action. And it's this idea of paradox that also inspires our panel today about human rights. So this is a panel that I co-organized with my colleague and co-editor Abigail Bakken from the University of Toronto. And it features some of the authors of a forthcoming edited book we are writing about human rights and the United Nations. And this will be published by Routledge Press. We are particularly interested in the fact that the United Nations has been so central to the development and advancement of human rights, but it's uneven. So as you know, we're now at the 75th anniversary of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the Ignite Change Convention is commemorating. The Universal Declaration enshrines human rights in universalist terms, and there's wide international agreement on its principles. This is, in fact, one of the most translated documents in the world. Yet, when it comes to action, it's far less straightforward, including even within UN processes themselves. And so this morning, we're looking at the promise and paradox of the United Nations, and we're very grateful to have a group of leading scholars to think about both paradox and promise in relation to issues that range from the environment and Indigenous peoples to the United Nations itself. So each of our panelists has been given a challenge, and that is that they are only supposed to speak for 5 to 8 minutes, and that is challenging sometimes for academics. And after they speak, we will throw the session open to questions from the audience. And so I'm going to introduce each speaker before they give their comments. And to start us off, our first speaker of this morning is my co-editor, Abigail Bakken from the University of Toronto. And she's going to speak to us about paradox a little bit more.
Thank you. Are we good in terms of hearing me? Yeah, we're okay. Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you to the conference organizers. And I want to extend my gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who have cared for the land on which I am, which is the land of Toronto, for thousands of years. So given the centrality of human rights to humanity, it is certainly relevant to consider the complex and contradictory relationship of these rights to the United Nations. Realist perspectives, which have been dominant in the field of political science since the 1970s, have placed emphasis on theorizing the role of the United Nations as an international organization of competing state interests. Alternatively, in this volume and in this political and professional and intellectual exercise, we're inviting our authors and our readers to decenter states and related interstate competition as foundational premises and focus instead on justice claims and challenges. So we ask, what can we learn if we consider the UN differently, as inherently paradoxical when it comes to human rights? we define the paradox of the UN in relation to inherently contradictory tensions embedded in this global institution's promise for universal human rights, where universal claims are both advanced and limited at the same time. In our introductory chapter to this collection, the discussion moves from consideration of the relevance of the UN at this particular moment of history to address the salience of human rights. And we argue, when viewed from the lens of paradox, that global universality on one side and state sovereignty on the other can be viewed in a dynamic relationship of tension and of symbiosis. So such a focus brings into sharp relief both the innovative possibilities which point to the universality of human rights, as well as the tenacity of sovereignty and state power that often limit rights for significant populations. And we address the value of considering the paradox of the UN in this context. The other contributions in this collection, and we're so grateful that our authors are here to share these comments, will variously address issues related to knowledge and knowledge production with a focus on the contradictory impacts of marginalized groups, on the UN and stateless or non-state actors, which might be considered generally in human rights policies, but denied rights in states, and also global challenges in relation to sovereignty and sovereign states. So in this context, it is important to ask why look at the UN now. One key reason is that precisely at this moment, the UN is encountering evidence strains, making it relevant to consider the UN, its history, and its potential. Article 1 of the 1945 UN Charter, the founding document of the UN, lists the following purposes: to create friendly relations based on respect for equal rights and self-determination of peoples, to create international cooperation, and having the UN to be a central point for harmonizing the actions of nations to achieve these goals. At the same time, today, the world order, despite the UN Charter and despite our contemporary talk of globalization, has reflected the power and sovereignty of national states, particularly the role of countries at the UN Security Council. The indicators of this are numerous, from the difficulties in reaching adequate support to counter the specter of environmental catastrophe, to the decided decline in multilateralism during the administration of US former Donald Trump in the United States, and to the reality of war occasioned by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and by the current crisis unfolding as we speak in Israel and Palestine. Indeed, reflecting on the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated, "The principles at the heart of multilateral cooperation are under the greatest strain since the founding of the UN." But at the same time, the UN is central for explorations in policy and scholarship of what we call the global. Arguably, the UN itself has been a place savior for the global in a way that is unparalleled in any other international organizations. This does not mean that the UN is without tensions, fissures, and fault lines. And another reason to consider the UN is important because it is very closely implicated with the term that we refer to as the human rights revolution. These formative commitments were given further lifeblood when the General Assembly advanced the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights, a document that is as old as the UN itself. We can recall that in 1948, there were only 58 countries that were member states of the United Nations, precisely because so many of the parts of the world were under colonial rule at the time. And today, the UN comprises 193 states, with Palestine accorded quote-unquote non-member observer status since 2012, a position shared only by the Holy See since 1964. So while the UN forwards universal language, it combines with selectively stark and inconsistent applied norms. In this collection, we focus on the paradox of the UN regarding human rights in terms of simultaneous and often contradictory processes of inclusion, which is chaotic and often also expels significant sections of humanity from, as Hannah Arendt states, even the right to have rights. Viewed this way, there is no single source of paradox, but multiple and recurrent patterns of simultaneous inclusion and exclusion that define the parameters of paradox. So the paradox of the UN becomes potentially an important place for advocating for something positive, something different, something otherwise, affecting transformation and rights claims. Movements that seize the opportunity to expose the paradox or contradictions, to highlight injustices, may challenge extant hegemonic knowledge and power sources that invisibilize or marginalize certain groups. So it is therefore time to revisit, we suggest, the paradox of the United Nations with eyes open both to the pessimistic and scary moments that we see, as well as potentially some optimistic potential for change. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Abby. And now we are going to move to Karen Morrow, who's from Swansea University in the UK, and is going to be speaking on the topic of environmental rights.
Bore da, good day. It's good for multiple time zones from South Wales, everyone. And this would be the ancient tribal land of the Silures, I believe, but they are no longer extant. I always feel, coming from the UK, we have very little to say on this, but a lot to learn. Thank you to Yasmin and Abby for inviting me onto the book project and for inviting me to join you here today. It's an absolute honor to be at this event. Although I have to say I feel a bit of a fraud because I'm an environmental lawyer, first and foremost, not really a human rights lawyer. But as you'll see, I think that gives me maybe a unique perspective on some quite interesting developments today. So my chapter for the book is entitled, Will the Right to a Clean, Healthy and Sustainable Environment Address the Wrongs of Environmental Degradation? And the answer to that question is not really. Some of them maybe, and that's 5 words and 5 seconds rather than 5 minutes. So you might want to know a little bit more about what I think about this and where the paradox is actually involved. Okay, so speaking in the this particular year on the anniversary of the founding of this organization based around the worst that humanity can do to each other and striving to the best, the United Nations is all about people. It is an anthropocentric organization by its very nature. It is people-centered. And that is how we are as humans. We can't help it. It's a necessary part of how we do things. But there are lots of different ways of being human-centered. There are lots of different sorts of anthropocentrism. And unfortunately, the way that anthropocentrism has operated in certainly the modern period has been in a way that is very short-sighted and has tended to treat the environment in a very instrumental way, as something that is there to deliver our needs and even more so our wants, and it's only of value for what it means to us as a species. And that served us very well as a species for most of our history. It no longer does. We've reached the point now where, while geologists will argue about it for probably a few decades more, we're now in a period that most of the rest of us would recognize as the Anthropocene, the epoch of people, when people are in a position to influence the Earth system at a global level. And many of those influences are very malign. So the triple environmental crisis that brings with it climate change, biodiversity loss and collapse, and pollution are just the headlines. Maybe the UN's chosen 3 horsemen of the current apocalypse in the environmental sphere. We could choose many, many more. But basically, a short-centered, totally people-focused way of doing things has put us in a really paradoxical position where we are a species that is on one level powerful enough to change the planet, and on another level utterly vulnerable to the changes in the planet that we are creating that are actually threatening the planetary conditions that have enabled us to flourish as a species for the whole of human history, the Holocene period, effectively. And that's all very environmental, but what does it mean for human rights? Well, for human rights, it has very definite impacts as well, because that exploitative dynamic doesn't just see us exploit the natural world, doesn't just see us regard the natural world as a source of resources for our benefit and enrichment. It's more than that. It sees us also seeing other people, non-privileged people, as there to be used as resources and to be exploited for the benefit of other people. Often, what is bad for the planet, what is bad for nature, is bad for humanity as well. And you can see around that the impetus to develop a human rights understanding that actually deals much more closely with the environment. And this is not a new understanding. This understanding that human behavior has a worrying influence on the world around us, and human behavior also begets exploitation and inequality between humans, was something that was recognized by the UN when they first started talking about the environment in the Stockholm Earth Summit in 1972. All of the ingredients that we actually needed to understand the situation that we're now in more than 50 years later were there from the start. The idea that treating the planet in an instrumental way begets pollution problems, degradation problems, and those also interfere with the enjoyment of human rights for many people. For some people more directly than others, certainly for First Peoples and Indigenous peoples, and we'll be hearing more about that later, but actually ultimately for everybody, that's what the Anthropocene means. The threats that are coming, threats are already here. Climate change is already happening. You've seen it in Canada this year with wildfires. We've seen it in the UK with flooding, etc. as well. So the UN has worked to adopt a right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. The General Assembly passed a resolution on that very, very recently. And that's great and it's commendable and it will help to address some of the human-facing aspects of inequality. But there's something that's still missing. Alongside the General Assembly resolution process, we were actually heading to the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, which absolutely nobody, even in the environmental sphere, and I didn't hear about it until after it happened, and I'm fairly plugged into these things, nobody paid much attention to. And it's very interesting there that you can see a sort of crossover between the ancestry of action, where the Stockholm environmental centered activities were focusing very tightly on the new right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And if you looked at the Stockholm outcomes, you would see that being endorsed by the UN environmental machinery. What you wouldn't see being endorsed is the thing that's missing from the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And that is a recognition that that right has to be built on a responsibility to care for the environment that is the enabler of all the rights we enjoy on one level or another. So if you just looked at the Stockholm outcomes, you would see something that looks as if the environmental agenda has just been subsumed into the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council's work on human rights. If you actually look at the global regional consultations, and this happened in and around the pandemic, so actually people were meeting from all over the world, very much like we were. There were 5 regional consultations, and there the environmental lawyer in me cheered because every single one of them said, yes, a human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment is a great start, but unless you look at protecting nature and providing rights for nature to actually place that in a workable ecological context, you're wasting your time. I remember in the run up to this having a chat with John Knox. We happened to be at a conference together, and I said, well, I actually think the environment's too important to be a human right. It's not the same as any other human right because everything else depends on it. And he knew what direction he was going to be taking already at that point, but he said, yes, he could see as an environmental lawyer, that would be totally how I would see it. I live in hope that other people start to see it that way too. And I think my 5 minutes is up and probably then some, isn't it, Yasmin?
Okay, thank you so much, Karen. That was really fascinating. So our next speaker is Utkarsh Kar from the University of British Columbia, who's speaking to a co-authored chapter with Cheryl Lightfoot on the topic of Indigenous rights. So I'm going to turn the floor over to him.
Thank you, Yasmin. Good morning, everyone. My name is Utkarsh Khai, and I'm grateful to speak to you all today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in what is now known as Vancouver, British Columbia. I've had the honor of examining the paradox of participation for Indigenous peoples at the UN with my mentor, teacher, and esteemed colleague, Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot, one of the world's leading experts in global Indigenous politics and current chair of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So while the UN today appears open and willing to engage with Indigenous peoples, our research has found that this was not the case for much of its history. In actuality, Indigenous peoples have had to fight hard for their place and participation in UN spaces, as they've always been viewed with a certain degree of suspicion. These struggles have been well documented through extensive research by Cheryl in her book, Global Indigenous Politics: A Subtle Revolution. Several UN member states have often felt and continue to feel that Indigenous peoples' participation is sometimes antithetical to state sovereignty and territorial integrity. This comes as no surprise, seeing as the United Nations is an organization of member states, founded by, supported by, and sustained by member states. The UN Charter confirms this in multiple ways and provides a magnitude of protections for member state sovereignty and territorial integrity. At the same time, the UN has also provided increasing space over the years for the participation of non-state actors in its deliberations. Non-governmental organizations, international organizations, academics, and other observers are also allowed various degrees of participation through credentialing processes that enable them to exercise privileges like meeting attendance and speaking rights. Facing both these realities, then, the UN has provided Indigenous peoples with a paradox of participation. While pathways for their participation are present, at the same time, these available pathways also represent constraints, particularly for Indigenous peoples' representative institutions, that is, their governments. In order to participate in UN discussions about matters that impact them while remaining true to themselves as representatives of their own peoples, our research has found that Indigenous peoples have needed to constantly and continuously make appropriate space for themselves within a structure not designed to include them. They have done this over and over through an iterative, creative dance, or what we have referred to rather poetically, I think, as the paradox dance. Our work argues that Indigenous peoples' navigation of this paradox dance has been and continues to be powerfully productive. The paradox stance has always required Indigenous peoples to assess the UN landscape, determine where the possible fissures may lie, and provide the space for Indigenous peoples to break through the constraints of the state-centric UN system and make space for themselves, table their unique issues, and find pathways of possible resolution. When the paradox stance of Indigenous participation is repeated over the decades in multiple UN spaces, meaningful change is the inevitable result. Indigenous peoples thus have and continue to create space at the UN that incrementally includes them, and by extension, created increasing space for other non-state actors and peoples as well. This diversification and grassroots democratization of UN participation ultimately challenges original paradigms of state sovereignty and territorial integrity, broadening both concepts to become much more inclusive of the variations actually present in our world. As such, over the years, the UN has served both then as a key enabler of Indigenous peoples' participation at the global level, while at the same time resisting and constraining their participation. We found that the passage of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was the penultimate example of the paradox stance, and the result of more than 2 decades of negotiations, which was often met by hostile and fierce state resistance. As deliberations for a rights declaration continued through the 1980s into the early 2000s, most states began to realize that the rights movement sought a fundamental change to the structure of global politics, fostering stronger opposition with every step forward. Despite this, Indigenous representatives were able to successfully secure meaningful change in several stages through multiple forms of resistance, advocacy, and even political protest. Our chapter goes into deeper detail, but notable instances included the ability to integrate models of meaningful and open participation through negotiation that continue to this day in the form of the Voluntary Fund. Through walkout protests and even hunger strikes over a period between 1980 and 2006, Indigenous representatives were able to advance meaningful, open participation by forcing the UN to re-examine its rather restrictive participatory mechanisms. So while the paradox stance has advanced to the point that there are now several mechanisms like the Voluntary Fund, the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, and the expert mechanism that consider Indigenous peoples' rights and issues, it remains the case as of today that Indigenous representatives may only be credentialed for those meetings either as non-governmental organizations or as part of a UN member state delegation. While some Indigenous groups certainly do organize themselves as NGOs, and a large number of NGOs participate each year, including large and complex national and multinational Indigenous organizations, for Indigenous peoples' representative institutions, that is, their governments, there remains to this day no pathway to sovereign recognition and participation in the UN system. Not only would it be inappropriate for a sovereign Indigenous government to register for a UN meeting as an NGO, but since Indigenous peoples are often in conflict with UN member states that host them over fundamental matters like identity or treaty compliance, it's also unrealistic to expect them to join a UN member state delegation. So while Indigenous peoples have enjoyed numerous successes along the way, a paradox of Indigenous participation at international fora still continues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Utkarsh. So if you are looking at the full program, you'll have noticed that Nicole Anderson from the University of Edinburgh is listed, but unfortunately she isn't able to join us due to a train strike. So we can think about another kind of right, the right to strike. But it means, unfortunately, we're not going to hear about her chapter. And I'll just alert you that her work was dealing with essentially the rights of the dead in light of skulls that were stolen from Indigenous communities globally and are being held at the University of Edinburgh. That was done historically. So it's a very interesting and powerful chapter that will be in the book. Then in terms of the speakers here, the next one on the list is Annie Chow from the University of Toronto, who's speaking to issues around migrant and domestic worker rights.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, everyone here. I just first want to share that one of the most significant learnings that I took from my work with Mi'kmaq community is to understand my own history. And so part of this, what I share in this chapter is some of my history and what I remember of my mother. Much of what I remember of my childhood is that my mom, a Vietnamese Canadian refugee woman, worked a lot. At one point, her work outside our home included cleaning for 4 hours in the morning at one condo, eating lunch in the car with my dad, who would drive her to her jobs, cleaning for another 4 hours in the afternoon, attending a laundromat in the evening, and then returning home to do some sewing. But she felt unsafe working alone in the laundromat, and her sewing jobs diminished over time. Eventually, she only had cleaning jobs. At 66, she had a stroke and reduced her jobs until she reached pension age. Everything in my life has been so much work, she reminds me. On June 16, 2011, the International Labour Organization, the ILO, an agency of the UN, adopted the Decent Work for Domestic Workers Convention, known also as the Domestic Workers Convention. According to the ILO, formalization is a means of and a necessary condition for achieving decent working and living conditions. Domestic work is particularly informal, as more than 80% of the world's 75.6 million domestic workers are employed informally, as the ILO states. This convention asserted that domestic work is work and that domestic workers have a right to decent work. Despite claims that this kind of work is foundational to all other work, why hasn't domestic work been seen as work? We can look to reasons of gender, race, and citizenship status. The ILO states that women represent nearly 80% of all domestic workers. Abu Laban and Bakken note the racialized patterns of immigration in which Black Canadians and people of color from points of origin in the global South are treated as cheap and or expendable labor. Women of color's domestic work has made it possible for white men and white women to participate in formal economies and thereby be recognized as citizens. But we ask, what of the citizenship of domestic workers themselves? Domestic Workers Convention, which was advocated by domestic worker activists and allies, tries to articulate a citizenship beyond the nation to focus on labor as a reason for accessing legal citizenship and hence human rights. Legal citizenship remains an important area of struggle for domestic workers. The Caregivers Action Center asserts permanent residency is the single most important change that would ensure migrant care workers can protect themselves against labor exploitation. Further, it ensures access to essential healthcare services and ensures family unification. Though important, legal citizenship is but one aspect. We see that the rights of marginalized citizens continue to be contested. Further, the focus on labor to achieve some semblance of humanity presents a paradox, as labor is used by the nation in both material and symbolic ways. For the poor migrant, the nation gives economic opportunity and legal status, or at least the dreams of such, marking her work as a kind of indebted servitude. Volpe states, this economic freedom now means that the citizen is urged to maximize her own utility by participating not in a shared political project, but in the sharing economy. So a model minority surfaces then, a subject who is gratefully and eternally indebted to the citizenship gifted to her. This debt perpetuates narratives of bootstrapping and stereotypes of Asian migrants in particular as obedient, subservient, and grateful. The model minority is not made invisible. Rather, the visibility of the model minority is made useful for disciplining the minority herself and other more undesirable minorities. Disciplining operates through illegality and estrangement, I argue. I remember visiting a cottage of one of my mom's clients. My mom, dad, and I packed into the car one summer day. They were an elderly white couple who took a liking to my mom. It was a friendly visit from my memory. Months later, back in their condo, a diamond ring went missing and my mom was contacted by the police. Feeling blamed and hurt, my mom, with the help of another client, wrote them a letter of resignation. My mom was not only offended by the accusations, but I think she was also scared about any dealings with the law. Getting paid in cash under the table was a knowingly risky strategy for my mom's hustle. The domestic worker is always anxious in her position, always up against the law because of her marginalized status, showing the limits of legal citizenship even. Capetillo, Ponce, and Crecedemas argue that the marginality of the migrant manifests itself as a precarious legal situation that travels with him or her. In her brushes with the law, they continue, the migrant is viewed as a lawbreaker, a tax burden. The migrant is blamed for marginalizing other people by taking jobs and resources that are presumed to be the rightful property of natives and legal residents. For a few hours a week, my mom cleaned for an elderly white couple who would often compare her to their other domestic worker, a live-in caregiver Filipina hired to tend to the wife's health needs. They complained about her to my mom, saying that this other worker did not do anything and talked on the phone all the time. My mom agreed with them. My mom was a quote-unquote good worker. She tells me that they were good to her too. The domestic worker is imagined as a stranger in the home and in the nation. As Bakken and Stasius lists say, she's not one of the family. Ahmed elaborates on how estrangement exposes the limits of the multicultural nation, revealing we are open to some strangers, but not strangers. Canada is particularly criticized here as a place where multiculturalism was coined. It is a country that comes closest to embodying the aspirations of the UN, as Abu Laban and Bakken share. With estrangement, Ahmed reminds us that inclusion is never satisfied. Its incompleteness allows for power to be employed over and across diverse bodies in multiple and changing ways, leaving such bodies in perpetual states of partiality. The differencing of and between others reveals the one who can be taken in and the one who might yet be expelled, Ahmed states. Citing Foucault, Gedeloff suggests power needs to be able to make bodies useful in specific ways to enable subjects of a particular kind in order to be articulated. So the target of a critical politics of social change is not to discover what we are, but to refuse what we are. The domestic worker is made knowable as a worker with this convention. And no doubt this has been a regulatory innovation, as Blackett points out, towards important life-changing and life-saving reforms. But what is also possible if the domestic worker refuses to be a domestic worker at all, or anymore, or at the very least, if she refuses to have her humanity be proven through her labor alone? I am unsure the UN can address this, but perhaps this begs more exploration from activists and scholars alike. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Annie. There were some notes of appreciation about your personal reflections in the general chat as well. And I also, as we're going, invite the audience that's online to feel free to post questions in the comments or chat function of the conference website. So our next speaker is Nuria Casanova from the University of Alberta, who's speaking to the topic of reproductive rights.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. And I really want to recognize that I'm a settler on Treaty 6 territory, and it's actually a settler colonial framework that did help me navigate myself as a newcomer back in 2014. And I really want to also credit John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights, one of the major conveners of this event, for helping me navigate my contested belonging at the time, and also really empowering me to be able to speak right now at the conferences of that scale and significance. You know, my topic is the UN's and Canadian states' compliance and non-compliance with the Beijing, Nairobi, and Sustainable Development commitments. Leaving no one behind is a major principle of the UN and its ambitious Sustainable Development Goals, which is very prominent framework. Yet the evolution of these goals can be traced back to the UN conferences of various kind. The focus of my work is on reproductive rights. And reproductive rights were born as a result of several conferences, from the Conference on Human Rights to the conference on the UN Conference on Population and Development, famous conference in Beijing, Women's Conference, signifying basically key milestones in gender equality and resulting in the Sustainable Development Goals frameworks, as well as Nairobi commitments in relation to reproductive rights. Leaving no one behind is a wonderful and ambitious principle, but to what extent is it actually addressed by the UN itself and the state actors that are involved in realizing this principle? To answer that question, with respect to reproductive rights, I examined both Beijing and post-Beijing and post-ACPD frameworks, more specifically setting the key agenda setting documents that were adopted and agreed between the states that resulted from those moments in global gender politics history through the perspective of intersectionality, meaning that I was looking at to what extent there's been this recognition that one's identity along lines of class, race, ability, disability, sexuality, gender identity, and the intersection determine the reproductive experiences. What has been interesting from my findings is to find out that although all these various identity markers have been present there since the moment of Beijing in 1995, the absence of the systematic approach is what characterized this key agenda setting documents. More specifically, I'm talking about Beijing Declaration of Platform in Action, which is a very influential document in global women's history. And so what my observations are telling me is there is this absence of systematic approach with sporadic mentions of certain identity markers, disregarding altogether actually the rights of LGBTQI people who were really actively lobbying at the time. The recognition that one's identity is actually defines one's reproductive reality came in post-Beijing submissions 5 and 15 and 25 years later, explicitly mentioning that the most marginalized women are lacking the progress. But a careful review of some of those post-Beijing documents, and they demonstrate the same persistent absence of systematic approach, despite the explicit recognition of the importance of incorporating intersectionality as one of the major principles driving those frameworks. And same tendency could be seen with Nairobi reports, which is actually strongly advocating for the adoption of reproductive justice principle, which is the intersectional framework, theoretical and praxis framework for realizing reproductive rights. And importantly, the reports recognize the fact that there is this persistent limitation, and they actually identify some of the reasons, pointing to the importance of diversifying statistics for the purpose of planning, implementation, and monitoring. What they are reporting is actually, although there were efforts globally to disaggregate data by sex, geographic location, and age, there is a persistent gap in reporting on markers like race, ethnicity, and migration. And although this is a significant step, tracing the consistency of coverage, social access isn't sufficient for concluding if the grand approach of this major force, global force, is mindful of the needs of everyone to realize that principle that it's claiming to realize. So closer examination of some of these key agenda setting documents finds out that there is a predetermined fixation, I would say, on women's bodies, putting ramification around definition of family planning as such. So it's closely tied to fertility, more specifically women's fertility, pregnancy, and one's ability to reproduce, where one's reproductive identity is determining membership in society. And in this framework, childlessness and the use of arts, as well as adoption, considered some sort of a deviant features of society, of family expansion. So there is this persistent procreation biogenetics idea of reproduction, which is not accounting for other ways of family expansion, families based on love, friendship, and variety of social, sexual, and economic relationship. And the discussion is also so centered on women's bodies, that it renders them key political resources, while the men are viewed not as reproductive beings, but rather than their allies with secondary roles in the process of reproduction. And although that space is seemingly opening up, it's for those with sexually and gender diverse backgrounds, the recognition of the diverse forms of family expansion is not quite there. In addition to that, there is this big movement for comprehensive sexual education, which is mostly targeting the adolescents, discounting the fact there are as many adults who are actually missed on that education and the aspect of mobility. Although I'm not talking here about the communitarian context, obviously, and some of the work happening in that area. Another interesting observation is that those frameworks are missing to explore analytical policy potential of reproductive choice or reproductive autonomy, childcare access, and empowerment nexus. And although those are major findings with respect to global framework as such that are setting an agenda on reproductive rights, those are insufficient for the discussion of UN's ability to realize the principle, because the states are the ones to uphold those commitments. And to what extent those states are actually upholding the commitments within those frameworks and mechanisms. So I've chosen Canada as an example, and Canada is a perfect example for answering this question, because this country, which is a settler colonial country, but it's also the country that is claiming that is known worldwide as a reputable gender equality country, global champion on reproductive rights, and country valuing diversity. And what is interesting is historically, and up until now, the country has been, at the forefront of the gender equality agenda, assuming leadership role as a convener, funder for sexual and reproductive rights, including their most famous feminist international women's assistance policy, which I want to mention is actually excluding 12 LGBTQI people. And careful analysis of how Canada has been reporting on those commitments, however, when you look at the submissions of the state, as part of this framework, and I'm talking here about Beijing, ICPD, and Nairobi, which is the most recent framework, demonstrate the selective reporting on the action areas of Beijing Platform Declaration and Action, selective reporting on sustainable development goals that are concerned with the question of reproductive rights, as well as voluntary national reviews. In addition, what can be observed is most recent report of the UNFPA stating and tracking the progress in terms of the states respecting those commitments demonstrate that Canada is not one of the states that created action plans and strategies to implement Nairobi commitments, integrated international sectoral policies, or developed systems to monitor that. Up until now, I would say that my findings demonstrate up until 2021, we could characterize Canada's approach to sexual and reproductive rights as exporting reproductive justice, actually, reporting mostly on some of the actions that Canada is doing to achieve reproductive justice abroad. Up until 2021, when the Sexual and Reproductive Health Fund was introduced to address the most marginalized group with some of the funding commitments. Yet the parallel reports by NGOs, which is an important mechanism in the UN system, have long demonstrated actually the reproductive violence as well as stratified access to reproduction for the most vulnerable groups, including Indigenous women, racialized women, undocumented migrants, temporary foreign workers, trans and intersex women, homeless, incarcerated, migrant detainees, those affected by intimate partner violence. And those violations, those horrific violations, they include but not limited to the cases of reproductive violence such as coerced and forced sterilization that are happening nowadays, which is unbelievable, towards Indigenous and racialized women, and apprehension of children by services. To conclude, besides operating largely on procreation biogenetics-informed grounds, the UN is unlikely to realize their ambitious "no one left behind" agenda. The UN is unlikely to realize "no one left behind" principle also due to non-binding nature of the commitments, as Canada has demonstrated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nerea. And now we are going to move to Celia Romulus from the University of Ottawa, who's speaking to issues of human rights in Haiti.
Hello, everyone, and I'm happy to be here with you today. And yes, I'll be speaking to issues of human rights in Haiti in a specific context, which was the post-2010 earthquake context in Haiti. So I need to tell you before I begin that my topic actually includes references to sexual violence. This chapter and this research highlights the contradictory impact of the United Nations in the Global South as an international body producing policies aimed at protecting women's rights in humanitarian settings, and also as a coordinating actor within the framework of humanitarian and development interventions that ultimately lead to infringing racialized women's rights. My contribution aims to shed light on the power dynamics between the political North and South in an era of globalization, and how they shape knowledge production on the disasters and imaginaries of recipient countries. In this case study, I analyze discourses generated and disseminated by the UN, international NGOs, and the media around gender-based violence following the January 2010 earthquake in Haiti, specifically regarding what was labeled a rape epidemic. And basically, I try to shed light on the ways in which the mainstream discourse on sexual violence disseminated by these stakeholders mobilize racist frames. Just to contextualize, the 2010 earthquake in Haiti was followed by a surge of humanitarian projects. However, not only did these interventions fail to meet the needs of the population and to rebuild destroyed infrastructures, they also contributed to weakening the Haitian civil society and the state. In that context, although women's rights form part of the framework of those post-quake development initiatives, the inherent flaws of the humanitarian programs, in particular those related to empowering women, have been a topic of ongoing debate in activists, but also academic circles. So examining Haiti at that point allows us to highlight the power dynamics underlying humanitarian interventions. And the discourse around the epidemic, it emerged in international and then local media. So I'm examining the links between the discourses and their impact on the Haitian feminist movement, and also as a means to highlight historical logics of domination of the Third World by the West via the propagation of Eurocentric visions of progress. So I start my analysis with reminders because a lot of this domination happens with epistemic violence and so erasures of narratives. So the reminders are both around strategic priorities of Haitian feminist organizations between 2009 and 2013. And then, like I told you, the discourse circulated around that epidemic. I also deployed 2 decolonial feminist principles, the questioning of Eurocentric narratives, and also highlighting those Haitian thinkers who rehabilitate, evoke, and create new discourses about Haiti. Finally, I would say that this intervention concludes by exposing some of the destructive effects of humanitarian interventions, which, backed by this campaign, were duly carried out in contradiction to the priorities of local feminists. The paper originated, or the chapter originated as a presentation at the annual conference of the Haitian Studies Associations in Port-au-Prince. And mainly, I would say, as a reflection on my experiences because I was working and living in Haiti in 2010. And I was directing the Safe Cities program on behalf of UN Women. So it's the results of a reflection on this experience and of ongoing conversations with Haitian feminists, some of whom perished in 2010, and some of whom are still continuing to work for a more egalitarian world imbued with social justice. So basically what we want to keep in mind is that in 2009, although the Haitian state offered no structured services to survivors of violence and had implemented few prevention measures, there was actually an increased interest and increased engagement of public actors around fighting and eradicating violence against women. So a few examples are the fact that that's when Haiti actually submits its first report on CEDAW. Although the convention was ratified in 1981, the first report will be presented in 2009. There are also legal reforms happening around that point and a concerted effort between Haitian civil society and the government to actually put in place some measures when it gets to supporting women survivors of violence, but also doing work around prevention. However, when the humanitarian response to the earthquake happens, there are actually national tools and structures that are in place. And these tools and lessons learned and ways of doing work in Haiti will not be integrated in the response. Around that time, Haitian feminist Danielle Magloire deployed the absence of economic and demographic analysis guiding decision-making and denounced an ideological bias in aid. Such aid was not deployed on the basis of an empirical assessment of needs, but rather on the basis of representations of the Haitian population. My chapter just basically illustrates Magliore's point in arguing that the emergence of a discourse on the rape epidemic was based on the hypersexualization of Black people and the institutionalizing of sexual violence and the victimization of Haitian women. And just to conclude, as Haiti remains, as Trouillot says, the longest neocolonial experiment in the West and always prone to intervention, it really is important for us to remember the lessons learned from 2010, especially now in 2023, when there are discussions of deploying yet another mission to Haiti.
Okay, thank you so much, Celia. And last but certainly not least, we have Andy Knight, who's going to speak to the UN in general and its future.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. And thank you so much, Yasmin and Abigail, for putting on this very important panel, and also for including me in their book. I have to say, Yasmin is one of the most admired colleagues in our department, and we've always had a very good relationship ever since I came to the University of Alberta. And it's wonderful to see that she is keeping at the tip of the spear of the questions concerning human rights, particularly so relevant right now with the Gaza Israeli situation. And thanks, Abigail, also for including me in this panel. Rene Bourgeois has to be given a lot of thanks, and the John Humphrey Center as well, for putting on this kind of panel to basically explain to the international community and our own community here the importance of the John Humphrey Center for human rights. The Minister of Justice alluded to John Humphrey Center as alluded to John Humphrey, the person responsible in large part for the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Canada's played a major important role in that particular area. So my paper is really part of the chapter dealing with the United Nations, as Yasmin says, everything about the United Nations, but mainly the United Nations policy debate that's going on right now within this organization as to what to do about crimes against humanity, about war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing. These are the core crimes that affect the international community today. And we need to be able to see what Abigail talks about here as a paradox within the United Nations in terms of addressing these war crimes, these core crimes. So I examine the issue starting with the context of Myanmar. Why Myanmar? Because I think Canada has tried its best through Bob Rae, who was a special envoy to Myanmar, who is now the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. But Canada's tried to help to build support for what's called the genocide prosecution filed by the state of Gambia with the International Criminal Court. And I think this is a really good place to start because we've had many years now of saying never again to cases of genocide and war crimes and so on, and these things keep happening over and over again. And Myanmar became a very important test case for whether or not the United Nations in its new development in terms of trying to deal with the norms created by the United Nations member states, the norm of responsibility to protect, whether or not that particular norm can be used to deal with the systematic atrocities, crimes that were being committed in Myanmar. As you know, in Myanmar, there's been 742,000 people displaced, mostly Rohingya Muslims displaced from Myanmar. 50% of them were children. And they are now in Bangladesh, most of them as refugees within that country. So with over 600,000 Rohingyas remaining in Myanmar, all being detained by the junta of that country under a system of apartheid. We see a lot of parallels between Myanmar and what's going on in Israel and Palestine today. There are 24,000 Rohingya people killed by the Burmese military and local Buddhists since the so-called clearance operation, which started on the 25th of August of 2017. And Canada has made it very explicit that the goal of the Canadian government is to make sure that those individuals who committed atrocities, egregious crimes against humanity, should not be allowed to get away with these crimes, and that the perpetrators should be brought to justice, should be held accountable, so that justice for the victims and survivors will be served. And yet still 6 years later, since the major clearance operation in Myanmar, there's still not justice. And this leads to the whole question that Abigail raised about the paradoxy of the United Nations system, a system that has a universal declaration dealing with human rights, dealing with the fact that we need to sort of address these problems before they become major problems. I guess that we continue to see them happening over and over again. So my chapter really argues that the international community has a number of tools already available to it to deal with these type of crimes. And the tools in the arsenal of the United Nations system can be found in the UN Charter. Some of them include Chapter 6 of the Charter, tools available to make sure that we can prevent these things from happening before they actually become major problems. But apart from the tools in Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, there are also mechanisms for peace and reconciliation. There are a mechanism for peace and reconciliation processes that involves the Secretary General's good offices, for example, that can help to bring about some sort of reconciliation to these problems before they become major challenges. However, there can be no true justice in Myanmar or in Gaza or in any other part of the world unless perpetrators of crimes are prosecuted for the crimes that they commit. And this is where the International Criminal Court comes in. This is where the responsibility to protect norm comes in. Now, this is a norm, not a law, but is a norm that has been strengthened as people recognize the importance of the norm, and the norm, the principles itself of the norm is cascaded down to different members of the international community. But despite this, we still see that the major organization, the major institution responsible for implementing this norm, which is the United Nations Security Council, cannot seem to be able to act, mainly because there is at least one person, one country within the Permanent Five membership who is opposed to acting. So we just had a resolution just recently calling for the cessation of violence in Gaza, calling for a ceasefire arrangement. And this resolution was defeated by the United States. 13 out of the 15 states within the Security Council voted in favor of this resolution, calling for a series of things to be done. And this was defeated by the United States, who is obviously acting in concert with Israel to protect Israel from any criticism coming from the international community. So this is something that we need to realize. Again, part of the paradoxy of the United Nations is that despite our goodwill, despite our attempts at goodwill, our attempts at dealing with these international problems, there is still a problem with the way in which the apex body of the United Nations system, the Security Council, acts under these conditions. Of course, the UK was also another member that did not vote in favor of that resolution, although it abstained from the vote. But both the United States and the UK can be considered to be complicit in whatever genocidal activity is taking place right now in Gaza. So I just wanted to give you a sort of a snippet of what the chapter is all about, and remind people that we have said never again, over and over again since 1945. One of the major crimes against humanity at that time was the Holocaust, of course, that resulted in the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews, but also in the systematic extermination of others as well. Slaughter of Roma, Soviets, ethnic Poles, some Slavic people, gays, disabled, and Jehovah's Witnesses. A total number of deaths in that particular Holocaust was 17 million people. We always think about the 6 million Jews, but there's 17 million people that were killed during that period of time. And the international community said never again, and tried to put in place through the actions of the International Law Commission, through the actions of the membership of the United Nations system, General Assembly, tried to put in place norms and rules that would prevent us from going through those horrendous slaughters of innocent people ever again. And yet still they keep happening. So obviously there's a problem with the UN system itself, something that needs to be reformed. And not just reformed, but probably transformed in order to be able to ensure that these type of incidents don't happen in the future. One of the reasons why I'm very big on the responsibility to protect norm is that I find that this is a norm that is not just a punitive kind of norm, but also a preventive norm, right? We don't spend enough time talking about the preventive aspects of R2P, responsibility to protect. But there is a preventive aspect that is not being utilized as much as it can be worked in conjunction with Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, which deals with the preventive aspects of dealing with these type of problems. And it calls on the international community to recognize the fact that nation states need to have need to be empowered, I should say, by the international community in order to be able to stop any challenges to the populations of the countries that are under attack. So I think that this is something that we need to spend a little bit more time on. And in my paper, I'm trying to explore the different areas in which prevention can be utilized, can be strengthened in that norm, in order to be able to bring about an end to these kinds of violent clashes and conflicts in the future. So I'm going to leave it there because I know my 5 minutes is almost up. But I'm sure the discussion would probably bring out a little bit more on this chapter on how do we protect the innocent people from slaughter.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy, for that, which takes us into some very current issues that are on the front pages of our newspapers. So we have a few minutes for discussion. And again, I invite audience members to use the chat that is open to them that I mistakenly used during my moderation. We have 2 chats going here. One's private for the group. And as I'm so I want to give the audience some time to think about things, pull through those questions, but just to kind of start us off, because, it ended, we sort of ended, and I'm also just noticing one of the comments here from Paul that it's important to hear these perspectives and hard not to get depressed about all the challenges, yet there's still hope for positive change. Let me ask whoever wants to answer on this panel. I mean, we're in a world where there are massive crises now, from the environment and climate change to war and conflict. Are we being utopian to look to the United Nations? Or is there hope?
Maybe I should jump in here. Since I deal with the United Nations on a regular basis, but I think we have to put things into context. Right now, we're living in a period of time that I call it an interregnum. It's an interregnum in the sense that we are moving from one world order, 1945 world order, a world order that created, in fact, the institutions of the United Nations in 1945. We're moving from that world order to something else. I think you can see this very clearly in the attacks on the fundamental structures of world order, the ideas, the material capabilities, the institutions of world order. These are pillars that hold up world order. When we see attacks on those pillars, we recognize that there's time to think about change and transformation of the world order. So we put it in this context. We understand why there is disequilibrium, why there is a lot more challenges in terms of wars and rumors of wars and clashes between people. This equilibrium of the international system is almost like an earthquake. Having an earthquake is, we see the signs of the earthquake happens before the earthquake actually happens. You see the clashing of the tectonic plates underneath the earth. before the earthquake actually happens. I think what we're witnessing right now is that tectonic shift that's going on globally, and it's being sort of replicated in places like Gaza, but also in Yemen and Myanmar and Sri Lanka, different parts of the world, different parts of Africa, for example. So I think we have to put it in that context. The UN system was created in 1945. It was the institution that sort of was an improvement on the League of Nations. But at some point in time, you have to ask yourself, is the UN still fit for purpose in the 21st century? Now that there is changes in the international environment, are the institutions that were created in 1945 still relevant for this current period? And this is a challenge, I think, for us. Obviously, I think the UN does a lot of good work, and that's one of the reasons why there's a paradox, as Abigail points out. There's a lot of good work that's being done within this organization, but you have to go beyond simply tinkering with the organization, reforming the organization in small ways, and think about maybe larger transformative elements that need to be done within the institutions of global governance that may or may not include the United Nations system. So I think I hate to leave you in that kind of limbo, but I think we are living in a period of limbo. So it's very difficult to say for sure that the UN is the appropriate body for dealing with all these problems. But it's the only thing that we have, this most universal institution we have to address many of these issues. So we started to think about how can we transform it to make it more relevant to the current period.
Okay, well, maybe another question to add in here, and I also want to invite Utkarsh specifically to address, because there's a question on elaborating on the participation paradox, or the paradox of participation that you mentioned, which was specific to Indigenous people. But I guess that the other question I want to ask the panelists, because of course the John Humphrey Center, we at the University of Alberta and many universities around the world are interested in education. Is the UN Human Rights Framework still important for education in classrooms? What about for mobilization in civil society? And maybe we can start with Utkarsh on here so he can also address the paradox of participation as well as that question.
For sure. Thank you, Yasmin. I'll start with addressing the paradox of participation and elaborating on that a little bit. So we found in our research that while the UN has opened up to spaces, particularly in 1980, once indigenous organizations were able to formulate themselves into an international convention for indigenous nations, and then approach the UN after repeated attempts to approach the former League of Nations, was shut down in the 1900s. They were finally able to gain access, but that access was then limited in the Working Group for Indigenous Populations. So, and particularly that paradox of participation as an instance in particular emerged when it moved from working group status to a working group on the draft declaration, where Indigenous representatives were only granted an observer status and not a speaking status or a participatory status on a convention that sought to declare their own rights in context of the rest of the world, right? So here, we find an instance of paradoxical participation where you're invited to participate, but you're only invited to observe and not speak. And so that paradox then moves forward with degrees of political activism, which involved a walkout protest at the time to sort of motivate member nations to recognize that this is a draft declaration for Indigenous people's rights. And if they don't have the right to speak to that draft declaration, then that draft declaration is in itself a hollow instrument. And so this is one step of that paradox stance. And then we see further steps take place through the 90s, through the 2000s, where different forms of opposition come into more substantive issues that are present in the draft declaration, such as the rights to self-determination, recognition of land and resource rights, where different drafts are presented by UN member states for consideration, or maybe attempts to delay passage of a draft declaration with article by article examinations of an already endorsed draft UN declaration, for instance. So that speaks to the sort of paradox of participation, where limited space is given, and then more space needs to be fought for meaningful participation within that system. And Yasmin, if I could have the second half of your question again, that would be
I'm just asking, and we're sort of, running into time here. So maybe, keep this to a sentence. I'm going to challenge you to a sentence after your 5 to 8 minutes. And we maybe can hear from everybody. But, how important is the UN still when we think about things like education in classrooms or mobilization in civil society?
I think it's a forum to hear from multiple perspectives present today. It is one of the only international fora that exist to bring multilateral perspectives from different parts of the world. And I'll sum it as that for 1 second.
Anybody else want to dare to have a sentence on this? Karen?
Go. Yeah, hugely important, because the challenges we face in my area are planetary challenges. They're not the challenges of states. Those sharing of values that we can offer through the human rights that countries have all signed up to is a stick to measure them by, is a tool for civil society, and is what gives our children something that they share, that they can take forward.
Abby?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if we're going to get to a future, we're going to have to go from here to there. We can't get to a future just through dreaming. We have to dream, because we have to go beyond what we see. So, I think Andy's right that we're in some type of a blurry moment, but that means that looking at the United Nations for the positive signs and hoping that that's what we build on, because there is opposition to the United Nations, as we've seen, from far right, neo-Nazi, fascist, white supremacist forces that are basically trying to dismantle the United Nations because they want to go back to the pre-1945 competitive violent world where the notion of human rights was not even verbally recognized. So I think we have to work with this, and that's a challenge, because it can be very frustrating.
I think that was more than a sentence, but it was a good point. Okay, anybody who actually wants to take up the challenge of a sentence? No?
I think it's very important, and it's not everything.
Okay, Celia?
I think that in order to think of a future, we need to think of the UN as people and practices as well. And I think in terms of social mobilization, collectives and movements have always used the instruments produced by the UN kind of against the UN. So I think, to me, that's always a sign of hope.
Nuria?
I have a hope as well, because it opened my eyes, like how the UN knowledge is produced. I was really amazed by how the UN, how the NGOs are actually making way through. In my case, it's reproductive justice movement. It's actually made that way through to the global arena, where reproductive justice framework is actually right now, speaking to the point of women's movements, as Cecilia mentioned, is actually right now adopted and recognized as a major framework in my area of reproductive rights.
Okay, thank you. And last sentence to Andy.
Well, let me end on a sort of paradoxical analogy. Right? The UN is like a plane. This has a defective wing that needs to be replaced or needs to be fixed. The problem is it cannot land on the earth in order to fix it, because there's so much to be done by the United Nations. So it has to continue to do the work that's doing, at the same time reforming itself and transforming itself to make it effective for the world that we currently live in. So this is a challenge for the UN, and I think this is a challenge for all of us to be a little bit more, how should I put it, a little bit less critical of the UN system as it were, and a little bit more understanding of the needs to make change and transformation in the institution at a time that we're going through this turbulence. And it's not going to be easy, but it's a challenge that we need to sort of take up.
Okay, I think we're all going to remember that analogy with the one-wing plane. And on that note, I know that there are 3 breakout sessions that are starting in about 5 minutes. So I want to thank all our panelists. I want to thank the audience for your questions and observations during the panel. And of course, the John Humphrey Center, Canadians for Civil Society and Writing Rights for putting on this conference. Hope you have a great morning.
Thank you all.